Hello and welcome to RPA Developer Production Ready Essentials training. In this video, we'll cover creating variables in UiPath Studio and using them to pass information between activities. We'll create a workflow that asks for input from the user and saves the answer to a string variable, then assigns a value to another string variable and logs a message with the two values. Let's start by adding a new sequence activity. Since RPA projects can get quite complex and are often collaborative, it's a good practice to give descriptive names to activities and add annotations. Let's rename it Demo Sequence. We can create annotations for any activity by right-clicking on it, selecting Annotations and Add Annotation. Let's pin the annotation so that it'll be visible. Next, let's add an input dialog activity. This activity displays a dialog box that prompts the user with a label message and an input field and then saves the user's input to a variable. Let's set the title of the input dialog to username. Now let's specify the information that we want to obtain from the user in the label input field. In the Activities Properties panel, we can see that there is a result output property. This is where we'll specify the variable to which we want to save the user's input. But in order to do this, we need to create a variable first. Now there are two main ways to create a new variable in UiPath Studio: from the Variables panel by adding a new line, or from the Activity Properties field and by pressing Ctrl+K in an input field that requires a variable name. Let's use the Variables panel to create a new type string variable called username. First, enter the name of the variable. It's a good practice to use camel case and enter a descriptive name for the variable. Next, let's choose the type. We can select one of the types shown in the drop-down menu, but we can also click Browse and select a .NET type from the window that's displayed. For example, dictionary property. In our case, we have a string variable. The scope input field determines the containers in which the variable is available. The default value sets an initial value for the variable when the workflow is started. Now we want to print the value entered by the user. Several activities enable us to do that: message box, write line, or log message. Let's use log message and enter the username variable in the message property of the activity. This activity writes the specified diagnostic message at the selected level, in this case, info. The messages are stored in the output panel and also logged for future use. Let's save and run the workflow. We'll enter a value in the input dialog. So far, so good. Now let's check the output panel. Great! We can see the value we've entered in the output panel. Next, we'll have a look at creating variables using the Ctrl+K method, using the assign activity, how variable scopes work, and concatenating strings. As mentioned earlier, each variable has a scope. In this case, the scope is demo sequence. For demonstration purposes, let's create a new sequence inside our sequence and call it assign sequence. Let's add an assign activity to the new sequence. The assign activity allocates any value that we set to a variable or argument. All you need to do is enter the variable in the to field and the value or expression in the value field. But before we can assign a value, we need to create the variable. Let's click the to field of the assign activity and press Ctrl+K. Let's name the variable status and press enter. Next, we'll give a value to this variable using the assign activity. For this example, let's enter is logged in the value input field. When we create a variable using this method, the type of the variable will often be generic value, and the scope will be set to the container which includes it. In our case, assign sequence. Let's change the type of the variable to string. Next, we can change the message from the log message activity to a concatenation of the strings in the two variables. The concatenation is obtained by using the VB.NET operators plus or ampersand. But it looks like we've run into some trouble. The scope of the variable status is assign sequence, so the variable is not declared outside of this sequence. In order to use it, we need to change the scope of the variable to demo sequence. Note that the compilation error has disappeared. Now that we've demonstrated how scopes work, let's remove the unnecessary sequence assign. Now let's run again and check the message in the output panel. And it looks good. Thank you for watching this tutorial. Goodbye.